Thank you. It's been good to stop at big thinker. I like that. As long as that doesn't equate to a big head, I hope it doesn't. So thank you all for coming today. I'm always pleased to get together with a group like this because you've all dedicated yourselves to make education better for the students and people of Texas. It's a hard thing. You all have other jobs, and taking the time to be here today is another example of your efforts with that. So 60x30TX, our board adopted this plan almost a year and a half ago now. Just for those of you who don't know, we had a strategic planning committee headed by Woody Hunt from El Paso and vice chaired by Larry Faulkner from El Paso, met for 18 months. They heard from experts from around Texas, the United States, and the world. So they really opened their arms. Fortunately, with the advent of things like Skype, we can get in experts from other places very inexpensively that can meet with that committee. We also distributed drafts of the plan to more than 5,000 people across the state and got feedback. Okay, thank you. So it was a very inclusive process, and I think what's important is this plan really focuses on students and student success, the entire plan, and which also means the prosperity of Texas going forward. Now, how many of you were on boards during closing the gaps? Were most of you there? So part of what we have to say is this plan is built on the success of closing the gaps, and all those people who raised their hands have a lot of responsibility for that success. You may not realize this, but before closing the gaps was established, people across the country would have plans for the states and for systems with 100 goals, 120 goals, and people sort of looked at us like, four goals? Are you serious? They were measurable. We had targets to achieve, but it kept us on track, and many plans in other states now look very similar to this plan. So all of you help lead the country in terms of taking a new look at how you do strategic planning for states and focusing on truly strategic changes, those are the things that make a difference. So thank you for those of you who helped make that the case, and all of you are going to help us achieve the goals in 60x30, which is structured much the same way. Now, one thing we've been talking about for 20 years is that Texas is going to become more diverse. Well, Texas is more diverse, and it will become even more diverse. And as Woody Hunt pointed out, the real question in Texas is not, are we going to be more diverse in 2030, but are we going to have a diverse and educated workforce? We need to be diverse and educated. If we're both, we're going to be very successful as a state, and we believe that will happen. So this basic plan is one that understands that the global economy requires Texas to have an educated and adaptable workforce. When we develop Closing the Gaps, we focus on comparing ourselves with the other states in the United States. With this plan, we looked at that, but Woody Hunt noted that it's now a time that we have to be internationally competitive. And one of the issues that we looked at as we looked across the world is my age group, compared to age groups in other countries with which we compete, my age group was much more educated than in those other countries. But with the younger population, particularly the 25 to 34-year-old population, other countries have made much bigger gains than we have. So we need to work hard to keep up with those other countries in terms of what they're doing and having a competitive workforce. The committee wanted to lead the world in having a competitive workforce, and as the commissioner will make a point, we want a workforce that can adapt to changes as we go forward, because the economy does change. But to be successful with this plan, it really requires that all of the state work together. It requires that higher education continue to get better and better at its work in educating students to become innovative, to become more efficient, to become more effective in producing graduates. It requires K-12 to produce more and more students that are prepared for college, and it requires industry to work with us. Now, I think it's important to point out with this sixth goal, this is really a global goal. So by 2030, we need 60% of Texans aged 25 to 34 to have at least a certificate, an associate, a baccalaureate, or a master's degree. Now, this isn't just a matter of producing graduates. The next goal that we'll talk about is your institutions producing graduates. But this goal talks about not only producing graduates, but keeping graduates in the state, because we have a prosperous economy and we have jobs for our students when they graduate. Like, you know, a couple of our student regents here, we want them to, they're very talented, we want them to stay in Texas when they graduate. But we also need to part of this is bringing people from other states. So a year ago, we had 55,000 people move to Texas in the 24 to 34-year-old age group that in fact help us reach this population. So if we do a good job working together, we produce our own graduates, we produce an economy that's thriving and lures other people here, we will not only have a more educated population from your own work, but also from luring other people in with those degrees, which it becomes a nice cycle. People who are educated tend to have children who are educated, and the state becomes more prosperous. So we really have no choice but to work together. Now, a lot of this is based on the work for the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, and they make the point that in '73, only 28% of all the U.S. jobs required some level of post-secondary education and skills. By 2020, nationally, they believe 65% of all new jobs will, and their projection for Texas was about, I believe it was 58% we'll need in Texas. But I'm hopeful that because of a thriving economy and the industries that we will create in Texas and lure into Texas, that it will require even more students with an education. But currently, it says currently 38%. Actually, since we developed the plan, we've hit 40% this year, actually have some level of education. Now, I need to tell you that in terms of Georgetown doesn't have access to certificates. We count certificates. We've counted certificates for 20 years. So we've had to impute this based upon our own data to come up with this part of the population. But certificates are very vital to what we're doing, and we'll see why in a minute. So our goal that all of you guys have a direct role and leadership in is producing, in the year 2030, 550,000 graduates who have a certificate and associated bachelor's or master's. Now, those of you that were here for Closing the Gaps will realize we didn't count masters when we were talking about successes then, but now it's clear that in a number of degree areas, a master's is required to be competitive in the workforce. So we want to recognize that. But that's just in that 1 year, 2030. If we accomplish all of our targets, remember for this plan we have targets as with Closing the Gaps in 5-year increments. Take into account other things we need to get there. But we will have 6.4 million graduates over that time, 6.4 million graduates. Think about the impact that will have on the economy. It's critical as we move forward. Now, what is college? One thing we realized with Closing the Gaps that there are many people in industry that thought when we were talking about college that we were only talking about universities. We're not. And that's important to realize. Certificates are vital. Again, we've been counting certificates for at least 2 decades in Texas. That includes Level 1 certificates for which you don't have to be college ready. Level 2 certificates, associate degrees, baccalaureate degrees, and master's degrees. So it's a communication issue that we realized after a number of years with Closing the Gaps that some people in the industry, for some reason, thought when we were talking about college, we weren't talking about community colleges. We couldn't be where we are without community colleges. We all know that. But we have to make that clear to folks, unfortunately. Well, we have to, in terms of getting where we need to be, we have to have multiple options in terms of getting there. We need to have online availability. We need programs in the different sectors. We need dual credit. We need competency-based education. All these things are critical as we go forward. And we can't neglect any of them. So the next goal is marketable skills. Now, I can tell you that some of your faculty are concerned when they hear us talk about marketable skills because they say that, well, we're about more than that. And of course, our institutions are about more than that. We want people to understand more than their job whatever job they take on. We want them to know something about history. They want government. It's important whatever you go in to know something about science, even though you may not become a scientist, because you can be involved in public debates about various issues related to science. But we need the people to actually have skills so that they have a reasonable expectation of getting a job. Now, marketable skills are not just what you learn in your major, though in our plan we require every program, all of your programs are going to have to identify marketable skills. What are the marketable skills from that program? But we need to develop marketable skills throughout the degree or certificate process. Certificates are a little more obvious because they're directly related to a particular job or career. But if you, say, look at an associate degree, that's a transfer associate degree, or you look at a baccalaureate degree, you develop skills across the curriculum, and including interpersonal skills, cognitive skills, and then, of course, what most people think about applied skill areas. All these are valued, but we need to make sure that, in fact, we are conscious of this as we go forward, that it's a conscious process. We need to be more deliberate about this. How many of your English departments, those of you who have English, can tell you what the marketable skills are right now of their graduates? A lot of them probably can't. But the reality is that the Washington Post had an interesting article about a week ago that talked about valuable degrees. They included history, they included English, they included social science. It wasn't just the technical degrees. But those are valuable when you know how to connect them to other issues. I'd like to give an example of an art history major graduate from UT Austin I met several months ago who was a Plan 2 graduate, had a degree in art history, but she also had a certificate from the business school in business. A cluster of courses fit within her 120-hour degree. She got a job at a very good museum because she both knew art, but she also had business skills. These are things we can do at all programs. So we need to make clear to our faculty that we value all degrees, but faculty need to make a more deliberate, persistent effort to make sure their students develop these skills. And it's not just within the major. And student services officers have pointed out to us, if a student has time to participate on campus, you can learn things in those clubs. When I was in student government at University of Houston years ago, I had $1 million budget. $1 million that I had some control over. I hired staff, and I had to fire a staff member. I had to learn something then. My daughter, med school daughter, has been the treasurer of every club she's been in. She's had to report to the state government, the federal government. She's developed real skills in those other areas. So these are things that we can happen, but we need to be more deliberate about it. I tend to think of it as changing the culture. Just as we changed the culture with success, you may not remember, and hopefully you don't. 15 years ago, it was very common for people to make an excuse for why students weren't graduating. That culture has changed. It still has, more improvement, but people don't think it's acceptable to say, well, this student is, they're non-traditional, they have to work. You need to find ways to graduate. If you're going to admit a student, you need to provide them the help they need. But we need to, and that's changed to a great deal. We need to do the same thing with marketable skills. When they walk in, they need to orientation. You need to start talking about marketable skills. The commissioner mentioned a few years ago, somebody wants to major in philosophy, fine, but they need to know what that means. And this ties directly into our last goal, which we'll get to in a minute. But it's important to remember this. Even though a student may go to college and they really want to learn about literature, ultimately, it's an exception if a student doesn't anticipate they're going to get a better job because they're going to college. We cannot forget that. We need to keep the faith with that student and their belief in higher education. And we need to remember that Steve Murdoch, the former state demographer, did a study with us with Closing the Gaps, and he made the point, and a very good one is, as you educate one generation, they're going to have more income to help generate the next generation, and we should have, each succeeding generation should get stronger and stronger and more supportive, and our state will get stronger and more prosperous as we go forward. That has not changed. So I've really talked about this a bit already, but one thing that we're going to have to do is work together to find a way to keep up with the marketable skills. Once your programs develop marketable skills, that doesn't mean they're going to still be the same marketable skills in 5 years. Things change. You need to stay in contact with industry. You need to pay attention to that, and you need to have some schedule. We don't think every institution has to do it exactly the same way, but you need to do it, and we're going to be talking to you about how to do that. And every new program you propose to us, we're going to be looking for those marketable skills. But remember to look outside that degree itself. Look at the entire curriculum. How are we going to help that person develop it? One school mentioned that they might develop a checklist, so when you come in, they know in general industry wants these basic skills. You can keep track for yourself. Here's how I've developed. Excel's right now very important. How do you develop? How have I learned to use Excel? It may be in a class. It may be working at Target. I've talked to some faculty members, some government professors who told me they had not even thought about using Excel in their classes, but it actually fit very well, and they thought they would include it in the future because the students could develop real skills in that government class going forward. So that's obviously critical. Now, student debt. Well, we want to make sure that by 2030, our undergraduate student loan debt statewide doesn't exceed 60% of their first year annual income. Now, this is a statewide goal. It's going to vary by level. The debt for the students who have debt at universities is a little bit higher. It's about 73% of their first year income. It's about 31% of community colleges. The debt is much lower in all cases than you hear in the national media. It's rare to find a student with $200,000 worth of debt. If they have it, they probably have gone to graduate or professional school, and they're building up the debt there. Our students is about $31,000 at universities, and it's about half that at community colleges, a little less than half that. But more importantly, only about 50% of our students have debt. So part of our goal is not going beyond that. We want to be sure that students can still afford to be teachers. We want to make sure that students can still afford to be social workers. We want students' career decision not to be totally driven by the ability to have to pay off debt that's more than they should have. Now, one thing that the committee talked about is debt is a combination of things, and you all know this. You talked about budgets this morning. Part of it is, what is the state appropriating to you? What are you charging in terms of tuition and fees? What types of financial aid is available to students? All these come together. They all have to work together. You can't just focus on one of these elements and have it work for students, but you need to be conscious of it. Every time you are setting tuition or fees, you need to be conscious of the impact it has on your students. And we all need to work together. One thing the committee talked about, is there a better way at some point in the future of funding higher education so everything isn't in silos? Right now, financial aid is funded in one silo by the legislature. Your appropriations are in another silo. Then you've got special items somewhere else. And how these fit together, there isn't a conscious effort of how these work together to help the student pay for their education. We need to be able to take that into account. That's much more challenging than anything in some ways we're doing here. So part of it as well is we need to build financial literacy. The board has appointed a committee that's going to be talking about not just financial literacy, but how does it fit with marketable skills? How can students be better informed? Can we develop an app at some point, because we don't have enough advisors? So if students thinking about taking Icelandic mythology, they can see it fits into my program, it won't cost me any more. If I take it, it's going to mean $2,000 in debt. They need to understand that. They need to make a conscious choice. And frankly, if they're well educated, if they don't want that debt for the Icelandic mythology, if they can read the books themselves. And we want to educate people so they're capable of doing that. I always mention that, but I've never read any Icelandic mythology myself. But so finally, the governor has supported this plan. We appreciate his support. But the most important thing is, as with closing the gaps, this requires relentless effort on the part of everybody in this room and your colleagues. It requires that you be creative. One thing about the way we develop plans is we don't tell you how to do everything, because each of you have institutions that are different in some ways. We're going to provide some higher level differences, but we know at the local level you'll be able to develop some answers to help your students in a way that maybe someone that wouldn't be appropriate somewhere else, or you may develop something that we'll see and we want to share with other people, say, here's a model. Here's something that maybe is working at Tyler College that would work great at San Jack or might work well at UT Austin, nobody's even considering. So that's up to you. Hopefully, within a month, all of you can do this presentation for me. That's the goal, but it will also become part of every discussion you have because it's about students, it's about helping students be successful.